All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. Again, my name is James Pinedo. I'm with WR Immigration's knowledge base team. And we have a great panel here for you. Today, we're talking about winning HR and immigration strategies for startups, how to avoid costly mistakes that plague a lot of entrepreneurs. We'll tell you how to watch out for those. Before we get started, we have a quick legal disclaimer. This does not constitute legal advice and is for informational purposes only. For legal opinions, please schedule a consultation. Now we'll get on to introducing our panel. Like I said, we have a wonderful panel. How about I let our panelists introduce each other? Charina, can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. I'm Charina Garcia. I'm a partner here at WR Immigration based in the Oakland office. And for the past 23 years, my niche has been in the startup world. And so I'm happy to share some of the insights with Michelle on how to manage your immigration program as you grow. And Michelle, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here. I am the founder and principal of Aspire Talent. My background has been in HR and people operations for over 10 years, working at various size companies from startups to large organizations, and here to share a little bit more about the learnings of what we see startups and companies run into from an immigration and a people ops perspective. And Charina and I have worked in the past for a number of years and excited to share some stories and best takeaways for you guys.
Yeah, so just a little bit about WR Immigration. We've been around for some time. Our headquarters is actually based in LA. And we do a wide variety of case types, industries. Again, my specialization has always been in startups. I think one of the coolest things about WR Immigration is its dedication to technology. So we have actually developed our own database that is Salesforce based. So if you're interested in seeing a demo of that, please let us know. And Michelle, why don't you tell us about Aspire Talent?
Yeah, so we are a boutique HR and people ops consultancy focused on the early stage companies, pre-seed to Series B. And the idea was really founded in the gap that we've seen in the marketplace. A lot of startups focus so much on talent, but they don't focus on what happens after the employee has been hired, or what are some of the operational pieces that need to be put in place. So we act as an interim gap before startups get their dedicated head of HR or head of talent, so that they can stay compliant on various HR compliance issues that startups may not traditionally know about. So that's a little bit more about our firm.
Yeah, I just have one thing to say. If you are an early stage startup, it's really important that you find someone like Michelle. Many times when I come in, I'm having to help do a lot of cleanup on certain things. So it's worth the time to even just spend some time with Michelle, just so you can have like a roadmap on what to expect, as your startup grows, which we're going to go through, which will give you like a little framework. So basically, the whole goal behind this webinar was to just give you some tools that'll help you as you either are a co-founder of a startup, or you're working for a startup and you're starting to hire employees. And what we really want to do is help you save time and money. Because at the beginning, when you're a startup, that's really crucial, right? Especially when you're still trying to get funding. As you get bigger and you're starting to take in more funding, Series A, B, whatever that's coming in, you start noticing that a lot of questions are going to be surrounding, are you compliant, right? What processes and procedures do you have in place? Who's been managing X, Y, and Z? And because, of course, the goal typically is to be pre-IPO, right? And to go public. And as you go public, we help a lot of our clients who say, we're pre-IPO, we plan to go public. Can you help us make sure everything is compliant, right? Because you have to make sure that you meet all these requirements before you can go public. So we're going to help you kind of manage that whole process. And we know growth is fast, right? I've seen it. You know, my client all of a sudden says, Charina, we got $100 million in funding and we need to hire 50 people by the next 2 months, right? And so I've been through that process, and we want you to be able to plan and understand what are some of the pitfalls and some of the things you can do ahead of time as you go through this journey of a startup. So Michelle, why don't you talk about the agenda?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk a little bit more about the different stages of a startup. Obviously, we all know that it's going to look different as the organization continues to grow, but of course, as what Charina is alluding to, the more the organization grows, the more complex it gets. So we're going to talk about the stages. We're going to go through the employee life cycle that we typically see whenever someone has been brought on into an organization. And we'll share some takeaways and best practices so that you guys can go back and start thinking through and implementing some of our strategies. And then we'll leave room at the end for any Q&A. If you do have any questions that come up, feel free to pop them in the chat throughout the meeting.
So Michelle, why don't you talk about what are the stages of a startup and its growth?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of what you were saying earlier, and that goal being maybe pre-IPO or getting acquired. And having been on the other side of the fence, I've sat and worked with the auditors and making sure the company is like buttoned up. The level of complexity is certainly going to grow as the organization matures. So, you know, at the early stages, maybe seed and early Series B, they're much more forgiving in terms of processes, but by the time you're later on in the stage, your venture capital firms are usually going to start looking for more processes and more buttoned up procedures. And then if you are going to be on the roadshow to IPO, the auditors will essentially start checking the different processes. So it's just really important to be mindful of these things at the onset and to start getting an early foundation created. And this is what we're going to be addressing of how to button that up at the early stages, because that's when it's the easiest, when it's still new and mobile, and can really save a lot of headache down the line.
Yeah, so when is WR immigration typically brought in? So I'll just tell you, I usually will be talking to students who are at, you know, finishing up their MBA program or their PhD, and they have this great idea that may be based on their thesis or whatever, and they want to start their company, right? And so usually I'll have co-founders who are reaching out to me, and either the founder needs a visa, so we run through the different visa types that they'll need once they graduate, or if they're international and they've been an entrepreneur internationally, or when they have their first new hire who needs a visa. And there's all different types of visas you can look at, right? And it just really depends upon the situation. Many people think H-1B is the first one. It's not necessarily, you know, that's the temporary work visa that a lot of people are familiar with. But it runs the gamut, right? There's like treaty investor, traders, there's intercompany transferees, people who have extraordinary ability, we call that the O1. And then sometimes J1 researchers are what we look at. So there's a whole variety of visa types that we look at when we're trying to advise and counsel on your first new hire or the co-founders. And the one thing you need to know is a startup is not precluded from pursuing any visa type, right? Many people will ask me like, well, we can't get an H1 because we're too small. That's what I do. I get H1s for companies with just one employee, and the one employee is the H1B employee. So, you know, it can happen. Mm-hmm. So, all right. You want to talk about some of the challenges?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges that I feel like in startup land, there's a common saying, like, you don't know what you don't know. So there might be things that just pop up as you're trying to make things happen. And then it becomes this balance of figuring out who the right vendor is that will be best able to support. So someone like WR Immigration can really see that proactively on the long term, how to make sure, you know, your employees are able to stay at the company or and continue working. So I think that's one of the challenges, is just not knowing exactly like what you don't know and getting the right partners, figuring out how you're going to manage it, who manages it, like whether to outsource it to a complete third party to manage or manage it in-house or bring on your first HR hire. These are a lot of the challenges that early stage companies will think about when they're starting to grow.
Yeah, and I think, in the beginning, in my experience, the co-founder does everything. They are the HR, they are the payroll, they are the everything for the company. And as the company grows, that's usually when they'll start looking at outsourcing some of the pieces. And honestly, it's with when the funding comes in, because honestly, there's no funding, you really can't pay, for outsource help. But once the funding comes in, I think that's typically when we start seeing our clients reaching out to the right vendors and seeking the right counsel. I can always tell stories about how, one of the co-founders was in charge of all the I-9 compliance, which Michelle will talk about. And that's just to verify people are work authorized, or they don't even do the I-9 at all because they don't even realize that you need to make sure that everyone is work authorized, or they have everyone as a contractor. That's very common. Everybody is a contractor because we don't want to have to deal with payroll, or we're just going to pay you with sweat equity or things like that. That doesn't really work in the immigration world. Sweat equity doesn't work in the immigration world. Those are typically some of the challenges we see as we're working with startups. So, yeah.
And just to add to that, that is something that Aspire Talent can help with, especially like setting up payroll for the first time or understanding how do you move people from contractor to full-time. Those are all questions that we can certainly help with. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the employee life cycle, and this is going to be the typical cycle at any organization. We're breaking it down into 3 primary pieces that we're going to touch on. The first stage being hiring and recruiting process for new individuals coming in. We're going to talk about how to retain and develop them, especially from an immigration perspective, and then termination and transitioning from the organization.
So hiring and recruiting.
The fun stuff. So a lot of startups will focus very heavily on getting new talent into the door. And what I've realized is there's a general sentiment of founders or just entrepreneurs wanting to go where the talent is, and wanting to bring on their first person. Doesn't really matter where they're based, but they just want good talent, which is understandable. And there's a couple of things to consider on that front. One being, is there an infrastructure to support where that individual is based? Is that being managed in-house, or is that being managed from a PEO? Because that will add an added layer of complexity, whether the organization needs to manage it or the vendor needs to manage it. And a couple of main points, like Charina alluded to, their eligibility to work. Are they eligible to work in that location? Is the company being compliant and making sure that they're able to work in that region? So whether it be domestic US and you're opening up different states, or you found someone in Europe and you want to bring them on, just making sure that there's strategic partners in being able to help with the hiring post getting them on.
So Michelle, what's a PEO?
Good question. So a PEO is a professional employment organization, and it's an outsourced provider that will hire the individual directly. So they'll act as like a co-employment. They'll do a lot of the compliance piece. So popular PEOs could be JustWorks, could be Charina, and they generally handle all of that compliance. But if an organization is thinking about moving off of a PEO and bringing it in-house, then they'll start to assume the compliance concerns, like making sure they do the I-9s, making sure they're filing for state taxes, all of those sorts of things.
So do most startups start out with a PEO, or they just do it in-house, or how do they normally do that?
Yeah, I think it depends. And this goes back to that challenge of like not knowing what you don't know, because there's a lot of HR tech out there that makes it easy and streamlined. You'll see like Zenefits and Gusto, but there's also a point where they don't touch the compliance piece. So just making sure that whatever vendor that you're going through, asking them, are they going to be keeping track of whatever benefits filings are required or so forth. So there's a lot of added complexity there. I think starting with a PEO, especially at the early stages, just outsources a lot of that liability to the PEO. But as an organization starts to grow and wants flexibility in how they manage their programs, then bringing it in-house and having, an HR person to run it is a good strategy.
So one of the components of an H-1B is actually showing that you're paying the same benefits to everyone else. And typically with a startup, do they even offer healthcare benefits or anything like that?
Yeah, there's different stages of when it makes the most sense. I think it depends on a couple of things like the budget, the appetite for competitiveness in the marketplace. And benefits is like a rolling program. Like when I speak to startups, they don't need to feel like they have everything rolled out at once. They can always layer on certain things, but in order to be competitive, there is usually added benefits being provided to the employee, at least like medical, dental, and vision benefits.
Yeah, I bring that up because when you're on an H-1B, you have to be a W-2 employee. You can't be an independent contractor, right? And so typically when I'm talking to a startup and they say, what? They have to be on W-2, we pay everyone as a contractor. And then I say, yeah, you have to offer the same benefits as you would offer anyone else who's an employee, right? And that's usually when it starts them thinking about whether they need to get benefits, what benefits are they going to offer, and then also all of the compliance pieces, right? Because do you give them sick leave? Do you give them vacation? Right. What is the criteria in there? Because California is really strict from what I can see,
yes,
right, of what you have to offer. But from the immigration side, I think the one thing everyone needs to know about hiring and recruiting, if you're going to be hiring or recruiting someone who's on a visa or needs a visa, is there's just going to be delays. And it really depends upon whether they're here in the US or they're outside and you want to bring them in. Most common is usually people on an F1 and you want to bring them on an H-1B. And then you also have to think about the wage component because there's a prevailing wage requirement. And that's usually when, compensation really hasn't been set, because usually that's when people are telling me, well, we're going to pay them X dollars, but they're going to get stock options. And I'll say, no, you have to pay them $100,000 and you're going to have to make it work, right? Otherwise you can't hire this person because there's a prevailing wage component to it, or they don't have enough money to pay that person. And so we talk about whether they hire them on a part-time basis, right? And so those are usually the conversations we have in terms of the first new hire. Of course, if they're not in the US, so if they're not in the US and they're working overseas, there's no immigration compliance with the US, right? What you have to think about is the immigration compliance on the global side. So, Michelle, why don't you talk about some of the recruiting compliance?
Yeah, I want to add to that as well, that hiring managers and I guess founders and entrepreneurs should just give a little bit more thought into what that timeline looks like of how soon they're looking for that person to start. Because like as Charina mentioned, if they do require a visa to work in the US, they may not be able to start in like a couple of months. And Charina can give a little bit more detail in terms of what that timing actually looks like, but making sure that these questions are asked very early on in the recruitment process, because it helps to just level set the expectation for both the candidate and for the hiring manager. And, and it can also be used as a factor in who or whether you want to move forward and hire them if they have proper work authorization to be a long-term employee of the company. And as Charina mentioned a little bit earlier, the I-9 process, the I-9 is a mandatory form that all full-time interns, part-time employees are required to complete. If they're a consultant, they don't, but if they are a full-time employee under a W-2, they will need to complete the I-9 form. And I will drop a quick note that not all software systems will help to keep track of expiration dates on visas. So that might be something that HR or someone needs to just manage, especially if someone's visa is coming up on expiration. And to just be mindful that not all HR systems will automatically do this for you. They're getting more modernized in that front, but not to defer that responsibility into a different vendor, because this is going to be a required document for all new employees that come on.
Yeah, and then you bring up a good point about I-9 compliance. So I always get the question when they can't hire someone and get them on a visa, well, we're just going to pay them outside. We're going to put the money in their overseas account. And my comment is always, are they working in the US physically? Are they actually doing things that are productive and helping the company? And the answer is typically yes. So you can't do that. I always get a lot of questions about how about if they just volunteer? Well, you have to worry about the Department of Labor codes and whether it's truly a volunteer, right? Can you honestly say that someone is volunteering for a private organization, right? So you really need to look at that. The other things I get is, well, they have a tourist visa, they have a business visa, or they have ESTA, right? Because many countries, if you qualify under ESTA, you can come in for 90 days. And they'll say, oh, they're going to come in and work, right? I say, you can't work. You can't work on a business visitor visa or on an ESTA. That's not a work visa. There's really a lot of limitations on what you can and can't do when you're on those ESTAs. And I will see a lot of people who are trying to help out startups come in for 90 days, go to Mexico, try and come back for another 90 days and do that whole thing. So you have to be really careful, especially now. The Customs and Border Protection, they're quite strict. They're asking a lot of questions. Just remember that it's COVID. They're not necessarily going to just let people in right now unless they really need to be in the US. And so I've heard a lot of stories of people being turned away. So, just be mindful of that as you think about those other ways to bring people to the US. So here's just a lot of compliance in terms of what questions can you ask someone to find out whether they're work authorized. And my recommendation is that you should always ask everyone. So either it's on your online application, or if you interview people, you ask them the same questions. Right, Michelle, you can't discriminate and just pick and choose who you're going to ask these questions to.
Right. It's all about consistency and keeping it simple as part of the process. It doesn't have to be complex, trying not to diverge off the script, but those are like just two golden questions that can be included as part of the initial screening process.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of run through the questions and some scenarios of what sort of answers you'll get from people in different types of immigrant, types of non-immigrant visa situations. So the question you always want to ask is, do you have the right to work indefinitely in the US? Indefinitely, that means for a long time, right? Indefinitely, there's no fixed end date. And then, will you now or in the future require visa sponsorship or any legal support from your employer, right? So that's really getting at whether do you need sponsorship? Do we need to plan for this, right? So if they answer, do you have the right to work indefinitely in the US? And they say yes, then of course they should say no to the second question, right? But let's say they say yes, they have the right to work indefinitely, but then they say yes, I also need to be sponsored. Well, then that's not making sense, right? So then we have to ask additional questions. And then most typically is this is the honest candidate. Do you have the right to work indefinitely? They say no, right? And do you need to be sponsored? Yes, right? That's the candidate who's basically telling you that if you bring me on, I will need sponsorship, right? And then the last one is, do you have the right to work indefinitely in the US? And they answer no. Well, will you now in the future need sponsorship? And they answer no. Well, then how are you able to work, right? So, just a variety of the way that they answer these things. But the additional questions, we put them here, right? This is what a lot of people ask me, like, what else should we ask? And I always say, well, you should ask these questions. Once they open the door in terms of saying that they need sponsorship, you can go ahead and ask these questions. Now, someone asked me, well, can we ask if we have to pay for the dependents and do they have dependents? And I said, no, you can't ask someone if they're married or they have dependents, right? The only thing you can ask is really limited to just the facts, right? So are you currently employed? So if someone says, yes, I'm currently employed, and many times it's like the H-1B, right? I'm currently working, I'm on an H-1B, it expires in 3 years. How much time do I have left? I have another 2 years, or I have another 1 year. Well, those should be alarm bells already, right? Alarm bells are, you only have 1 year left on your H because it's a 6-year maximum, right? And if they say they only have 1 year left on their H and you contact me, I'm probably going to tell you this is not a good hire, right? If they have 2 years left, then I'll say, oh yeah, we could probably make that work, right? If they actually are in the green card process, then we probably have more flexibility and you may be able to hire this person, right? But we really look at all these questions, like, when does your work authorization expire? How much time do you have left? This is also the same for an F1 student, right? They're on STEM OPT and they tell you that, F1 students get 1 year of work authorization. And then if they're in a STEM field, they graduate in a STEM field, they get another 2 years. So if an F1 student comes to you and says, well, yeah, I'm on STEM OPT and I have a year left on my STEM, right? Well, in order to get STEM OPT, you have to be an E-Verify employer. And Michelle's going to talk a little bit about E-Verify. And so, you may or may not be able to actually hire that person, right? Or if you're going to be hiring them, how soon do you need to sponsor them? Because yes, maybe they can work for you for the next 6 months to a year, but at some point you're going to have to let them go, right? Unless you can find a different way to keep them work authorized. A lot of petitions, or case types, you have to transfer them. An H-1B, a TN, an O-1, an E-3, even a J-1. If you find a candidate who's here on an intercompany transferee, an L-1, that's not going to be a good hire for you because that person can only work for the company that hired them abroad and brought them here to work for their affiliate or subsidiary. So a lot of complications there. And then if you find someone who's on an H4 EAD, which is very common now, your spouse is on an H1 and you have an H4 EAD, the EAD itself expires. And once it's expired, they can't work at all. And many times they will tell, I just was counseling someone and they said, oh, she said she's on an H4 EAD and she filed an extension and she should get it in May, or whenever. She'll get it in September. And I said, when did she file it? She said she filed it in May. And I said, did you know that H4 EADs are taking 10 to 12 months? She's not going to be able to work for you, right? She's not going to get it by September. So really, you have to ask a lot of questions because the candidates may be misinformed or they just may not want to tell you. Or you actually get to the level of the I-9 and you're filling out that I-9. And then you discover that this candidate actually didn't tell you honestly about their work authorization. But Michelle, at that point, if they come to you and you I-9 them and they have a work permit that expires in 3 months, can you just simply let them go?
I think that's something that they would need to work with their employment counsel on and
Yeah.
double check and see what's the best way to transition, or what other creative solutions you can as a workaround. But at that point, definitely loop in counsel.
Yeah, you really need to talk to counsel. And then usually when that situation happens, that's typically when a lot of my clients are saying, what could we have done to avoid this? And I said, what you could have done is talk to me, right? So that's how you could have avoided it, is if you just had reached out to immigration counsel and said, we have this candidate, this new hire, here's their resume. And I can read a resume and I can understand what the situation is and kind of help you through it. I think the harder thing is when this candidate is amazing and you'll move the sun, the moon, everything to get this candidate. And I'm basically telling you it's not going to happen, right? And you don't want to go down that path of violations just because of this candidate, right? You really need to look at those things and think long and hard about whether you're willing to hire someone that doesn't have valid work authorization. So let's talk about the timeline to onboarding, Michelle.
Yeah, so just following up on what you just said, making sure there is that proper work authorization, being diligent about asking those questions so that there is just level set expectations on both parties. I think, Charina, one question that came up was, when they are transferring their visa petition, how soon can they actually start to work? Do they need to wait for the full-time approval? Should the company take the risk and just have them start? Any best practices or advice on that front once it's been filed?
Everything is based on what's going on in the world, right? So I can tell you right now, if you hire someone on an H and they want to transfer, they won't work based on the filing of the receipt, right? Many of my clients right now, their new hires want the H1 approved. Well, if they want the H1 approved, you're going to have to pay for premium processing, which is $2,500, right? So you can get a decision in 15 days versus 2 to 4 months, right? And when you have that sort of situation, can you pass off the $2,500 to the employee? Maybe not, right? Just kind of depends on what the need is, right? And what's the business need. And so what I always say is, if you have someone on a visa, you should factor at least a delay of 6 to 8 weeks before you can onboard them. And longer if they've been laid off, there's gaps in their employment, right? We've seen situations where people were laid off last year, and then they've been filing B2 extensions, or they're switching to H4 and their case is still pending, and we can't move them back to an H1, right? So it gets really complicated. Also for startups, you have to think about, if the person says, I'll only start based on an approval, well, for a startup, they're probably worried, especially if this is the first H you're doing. But you also have to factor in that you may get a request for evidence, and the government's going to ask for a lot of documentation about the company, the viability, all of that. So that's going to delay it. For students on an F1 STEM OPT, like I said, you have to enroll in E-Verify, right? Michelle, can you tell them what's E-Verify so they kind of have an idea of what that is?
Yeah, I've implemented it in the past for a company, and it's just an added layer that organizations will need to do on top of the I-9. So they complete the I-9, and then once they get the documents, they have to input it into this government base to just run it through their system. So it's just an added layer to check to make sure the documents are valid. And if there ever is a flag, there's some very strict controls and what the company needs to do. And it's also something that you can't pick and choose who gets sent to E-Verify. It's something that all organizations, once they decide to enroll in E-Verify, have to do for all employees that come through. So from a strategic perspective, it makes sense if you are hiring more of the F1 STEM students and you want them to get the extension, but it's a strategic decision whether or not they wish to roll it out to the entire organization. So
yeah, I've had larger organizations and they want to hire someone on a STEM, but they're not going to implement E-Verify because you don't just have to put that person you hire on an F1 visa through E-Verify. You have to put in everyone after you join E-Verify. So, you have to really understand what you're committing yourself to when you do that. If you have someone who's on a TN or an E3, so you have Canadians or Australians, right now, you have to think about any sort of restrictions there are on travel if they have to go get a visa stamp. And then for the EADs, people on a work permit on the EAD, you really need to watch when it expires, when they can extend it, and whether they can work while the extension is pending. So for F1 STEM students, they can work up to 6 months while it's pending. For those who are being sponsored for a green card, they can work for up to 6 months while it's pending. But anyone on an H4 EAD, you can't work once it's expired, even though you timely filed. And so there's going to be a lapse and a gaps in their ability to work. Mm-hmm. So let's move on to retaining and developing, Michelle.
So this section is all thinking about what does the long-term outlook look like for the employee? How do you keep an employee engaged and able to work for the company, both from an immigration perspective and also from a career development perspective? And one common approach that companies will have, especially as they start growing, is setting up different offices and creating either international expat assignments or moving employees to different offices to help with, fostering cross cultural collaboration and just expansion and growth opportunities in that region. So if a company is considering going down that route, there's a lot of things to think about when expanding internationally. You can, of course, always use a PEO in helping hire an international employee, but if you want to eventually move employees to and from different offices, then it's going to require an added level of setup. So setting up entities, setting up bank accounts, then you can work and get like L1 transfer visas to move between different offices and create a blanket, which maybe Charina can speak about. But those are all strategies in how do you grow and develop your employees so that they can get a bit of other exposure outside of their main office. And another thing to think about, especially in making sure you don't run into future work authorization problems, is thinking about green card sponsorship. Like, how long can the employee stay with the firm if they have a set timeline on their visa? So companies should think about putting together a policy of when they start to sponsor green cards, and so forth.
Yeah, I think typically, when you're hiring someone, they will ask about green card sponsorship because many of them, that's their end goal, right, is to be able to stay in the US permanently. And especially if you find someone who is on an H1 and they're nearing the end, they have 2 years left and they've never been sponsored before, you really need to think about that and budget for that. If you're looking at an F1 student and they are at the tail end of their STEM OPT, then you're probably going to have to put them in the H1B lottery, right? And then when because what typically happens is you'll hire someone in F1 and they have 3 years left. They have 2.5 years left, right? Well, can you get them through the green card process in 2.5 years? Probably not if they're born in China or India, because that's going to take like 6 to 8 years. Or will you need to put them in the H1B lottery registration? And so you have to really think about all of that because that's all going to be part of the process in the future. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how soon do we sponsor someone for a green card? depending upon the market or the industry, it may be hot where they won't actually join you unless you say, yes, we'll start your green card tomorrow. Many of the companies I represent have been changing their green card sponsorship policy to 3 months, right? It's no longer the 1 year, or we'll wait until you have 2 years left on your H. Many times it's, we'll do it within 90 days. And then of course, who's going to pay for everything, right? Because under the law, if you're doing a perm, the employer has to pay for everything. Even for an H1, the employer has to pay for everything. And then what happens if they leave? Are you going to try and get that money back? Because most likely you can't, right? It's pretty difficult to seek reimbursement. Well, in California, I know it is, of certain legal fees that are reimbursable. So, just a lot of things you need to think about as you're developing your policies. The other thing is, are you going to pay for dependents? Because that can add up too. If they have a spouse, are you going to pay for the spouse's work permit? Are you going to pay for the spouse's green card? Are you going to pay for the children? All of that. So you really have to think about all of that in terms of being able to retain employees. Mm-hmm. So we want to talk about some remote teams.
Yes, this is a very hot topic, especially nowadays, and thinking about the future of work and where employees are able to, or employers are wanting to have a more dispersed, flexible schedule for their employees. And there's a lot of complexity that comes with remote work. Of course, on the compliance side, are you set up to work in that location? Can you find a partner, like a third-party vendor that can support international hiring or just different hiring in different states? Kind of earlier on what you were saying, Charina, is like I've encountered startups or companies where they run out of time on their visa and the company wants to maybe consider opening up an entity or an office in their home country so they can support that employee. And that's, a strategic decision for the company, but it always comes down to, is there a structure or infrastructure in place to be able to establish that presence, and making sure that you find a partner with the right vendors that will enable you to stay compliant and enable you to move quickly. There are certain vendors out there that can help companies go remote a lot faster, but it's all, best practices is to think about what is the longer term strategy and approach for the firm. And there's a bunch of other pieces to think about from a communication and a culture perspective when deciding to go fully remote or deciding to expand to different offices and internationally.
Yeah, I think in terms of remote within the US, I get that question a lot because a lot of companies are becoming fully remote. A lot of my startups actually don't have offices anymore. They're fully remote. And you'll have people that are working in Texas. And if they're on an H1, you have to, make sure that you file it with the worksite location in Texas, even if it's from their home, because the government will actually come and visit and make sure and do site inspections, right? And so if they move, like let's say they were working in the Bay Area and they decide to go to Texas, you have to actually amend that H1 before they move. If you amend it after, then you're going to have some issues and compliance issues, and probably the employee will have maintenance of status issues. So you really have to think about all those things. And then we have some employees who just decided to go home. They decide to just go home back to India or to their home country to work because they could work remotely. And you have to think about, I think from the employment standpoint, from an immigration standpoint, well, if they decide to work at a country they're not a citizen of, do they have the proper work visa, right? Because I've seen situations where they say, well, I'm in Paris and I'm here on a visitor visa, but I'm working, right? So the question is, okay, well, do you have the right work visa? Are you going to be taxed by France? So you have to think about those things. We also have situations where people just want to go home because they want to visit their family, and then they're stuck in India. And then they've been stuck for 6 months. And then the questions are, well, what do we do with this person now? Are we establishing a presence in India? Do we have to pay certain taxes? All of that. So you have to really think about all those things. Because of COVID, it's really hard to get people back into the country and get waivers. So yeah, I think when you start working on remote teams, you have to remember that you still have to maintain immigration compliance, right? So why don't we move on to termination? So this is the end, I guess, the end of the life cycle.
Yes. Yeah, so transitioning employees, which is never an easy thing. Of course, making sure that the compliance is, like, every country is going to have their different policies and how to terminate and best practices there, but making sure that you're buttoned up on that front and informing the proper parties. Charina, what do you do when you have an individual that you're terminating who is on a visa? What is that process? What should HR or their hiring manager be aware of when you are planning to terminate someone with a visa?
So typically what happens is that they're on an H1 visa. So I'll just give you the scenario of an H1. So you have someone on an H1 and you're planning to terminate them, whether it be for performance or just a RIF, a reduction in force, doesn't matter. Once you terminate them, they have a 60-day grace period to either leave, change to another status, or find a new employer who'll file a transfer petition for them, right? And typically and then you notify the immigration service, right? You tell them that this person is no longer with the company because you're required to under the H-1B. And if you're terminating them, you also have to offer them return transportation home, right? So has to be reasonable, could just be a one-way ticket back home. And then you don't have to pay for moving expenses or their dependents. Just basically the goal is, if you're going to terminate someone before their H-1B expires, it's your responsibility to ensure that, they leave the country, but you can't force them to leave. You can only offer it. And if they don't take it, then they don't take it, right? But you've met your obligation if you offer the one-way ticket home, right? But in many situations, what ends up happening is the employees will come back and they'll say, okay, the company will say your end date is September 15. You have a 60-day grace period. So November 15 is when, you're no longer going to be in H-1B status. And then they start negotiating with the employer and they'll say, well, could you put me on a leave of absence? So instead of my termination date being September 15, can you put me on a leave of absence until November 15? So Michelle, what do you say to that about putting people on a leave of absence?
It's all about consistency and making sure that once a decision and process has been established, to stick with that for all other future employees that have that scenario. And I will defer that to, I guess, you and employment counsel, but from a employer standpoint, that's on them, whether or not they want to offer an additional generous period. I haven't typically heard that happen, and employers just staying firm with that 60-day window. But it's really ultimately up to the company and how generous they want to be with offering that option, with a caveat that once it's been offered, to stay consistent with future employees.
Yeah, during the COVID times and, when they were having reduction in force because there was just not enough, work, we saw more leniency and employers really wanting to help out. And so they may do like a leave of absence. But then, of course, I always say, well, you have to think about, benefits and whether you're going to continue benefits. Like, what are you going to do there? You have to treat everyone the same. So when you're thinking about those types of things, always reach out to employment counsel or immigration counsel to kind of walk through it and just make sure you're fully compliant. And I've had situations where, the employer has said, no, I'm sorry. And the employee just keeps coming back and say, well, can I get a job in this department? Can I do this? Can I do that? and it starts becoming really a difficult situation. So just make sure you're consistent with how you treat everyone if you're going to go down that path of leave of absence. So takeaways, Michelle, what sort of takeaways can folks get from this webinar?
Yeah, we covered so many different pieces, but general takeaways is that establishing a strong foundation makes it so much easier for everyone down the line. And that foundation includes like different processes, different policies, making sure you're partnering with the right vendors and firms to help with whenever you're encountering a certain issue. And it helps with scaling as well. So if organizations are starting to grow really quickly, instead of having to reinvent the wheel every single time a scenario pops up, that's really where the infrastructure comes into play. And, you know, it doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be rethought about every single time a situation comes up, which is, you know, partially why HR is in place to say no, or to keep people within bounds and to remind them of whatever consistent policies have been put into place. And then a couple of the policies that we discussed that individuals or founders should think about would include like the green card sponsorship. What do they want to put into place for their individuals who need sponsorship, how to best structure the recruitment process and making decisions upfront and early, like what's their tolerance for a waiting period to have someone join? Is that a route that they're open to going to? And other longer term strategic policy decisions on what's the global mobility policy look like? What do they want to, what are the things that they need to consider if they want to set up an office in a new location and move people over to different offices as part of their growth and development. So generally speaking, policies and processes and partnering with external firms and vendors will help with just maintaining consistency and create a good foundation so that the startup can really scale with ease and not have to trip up or reinvent the wheel every single time.
Yeah, I think, you know, these are really important takeaways to get from, I know this webinar was only an hour and we covered a lot, and you probably have a lot of questions, you know, in terms of, you know, or certain situations, you know, and how you navigate those. So what I'll do is I'll turn it over to, I don't know if we have any questions, but if we have any questions, you're more than welcome to put it in the Q&A. This is our contact information, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions. James, do we have any questions?
Hey, Charina, yeah, we do. We have a couple here.
Okay.
First one is from David. Do you mind if I just read it out to you?
Sure.
Okay. David asks, ideally, who best manages the interaction between the client and WR? What are some of the initial mistakes made by these earlier startups?
Oh, who within the organization manages it? Michelle, what do you say? Who within the organization manages the relationship with the vendors?
Yeah, if they don't have an HR person in place, then it usually goes to the founder or their chief of staff or someone in the operations department. But if they have someone in HR, like recruiters might handle the process. And that's how me and Charina got acquainted originally, was I was on the recruiting team and I got to know this stuff very well. So it really depends on what the existing structure looks like.
Yeah, so I'll just tell you my experience of what I've seen. So I typically get, you know, founders who will come to me and say, hey, I have this person that we want to hire. And then I'll actually, you know, there's some amazing founders that I've worked with who are now like leading industries and leading companies. And we all started just in the very beginning of, hey, I have a TN. Can you help me do this TN? Right. And they were actually paying my bills. They were doing everything. And then as they scale up, they usually will get an office manager, honestly, first. And I'm usually working with the office manager. Office manager's fine, you know, because they're the jack of all trades and they're just running everything. And there's compliance pieces like postings and all of that. And making sure things are up to speed. And office managers are great if they can do it all, right? But at some point, it's really hard to find an office manager, I think, that can do it all. So at some point, you actually have to find someone like a Michelle to actually offload the HR portions, right, Michelle?
Yeah, and just to add to that too, like you're going to be getting confidential information about the employee, their salary, their family, and all of that. So just making sure that whoever is managing that has like the authority to see that information, and being sensitive around who's handling it and how it's being stored, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the beginning, because I used to run my own firm, like I was the everything. So I dealt with the complaints, I dealt with the issues with the production, I dealt with the clients, I dealt with all of that. And as you scale up and you grow, you have to learn as a co-founder to let it go and give it to the experts.
Yeah.
Because your goal and your job is to grow your startup and get it to where it needs to be. Yeah, so hopefully that answers David's question.
Great. We have another one from Batu. Do you mind if I read it to you?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, I am an electronics and communications engineer with an IMBA from the USA and PhD in finance. I have also good knowledge of distributed energy resources, energy digitalization, and all new technologies related to energy transition in a battle against the climate change. Besides, my PhD thesis was on spectral analysis, which is an important statistic technology for predicting and forecasting. May I get O-type visa and how?
Oh, okay. So O1 is extraordinary ability visa, and you have to meet certain criteria in order to get it. So, some of the criteria you've judged the work of others, you've won awards, you've been published, news articles about you, critical role, all of that. So my recommendation to you is, in order for us to assess those types of things, we actually have to look at a CV, so a resume. And then we also have to look at, we usually send a questionnaire and we ask you to fill it out. The O1 Extraordinary Ability Visa is one of the hottest visas, right? Because if there's no H1, everyone goes for an O1. And the O1 is a lot of work if you're trying to build your credentials, meaning that you're trying to build it to meet the requirements of the O1. And what typically happens for us is, just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you're O1 material, right? And you could not have a PhD and still be O1 material, right? So there's a lot of factors that we look at in deciding whether you can meet that O1 criteria. So my recommendation is to, if you're interested in getting an assessment, to just send your information to me at the email address listed there, and then we can help you do the assessment.
And also to add on that as well, some employers, like I think the O1's more expensive in terms of a filing perspective, is that right, than the other visa?
Yeah, you can typically spend about $10,000 on an O1 with all the fees and then the time and all the expense of, you have to ask people to do letters of recommendations and a variety of things. So it can add up.
Yeah. So making sure that the employer is also willing to go that route, because it is quite extensive from an HR or support perspective in getting the O1. So just to double check if the organization is willing to go that route.
Yeah, and we do a lot of co-founder O1s. So entrepreneurial O1s, we do a lot of those too. So.
But you had a follow-up to that. Do we have time, or?
I guess we can do it for one more minute.
Okay. Mm-hmm. If a university or college in the USA would hire me as a teaching instructor or professor remotely from my country via online education, would I need a work visa then?
I don't know. You'd have to check with the university and find out. I don't know international employment laws, right? Like I said, if you're not physically in the US, you don't need a visa, right? And he's basically saying he's not going to be physically in the US. So, well, I think time's up. I hope you guys have enjoyed our webinar. Thanks, Michelle, for sharing all your insights. It's been really informative. James, thanks for helping us out and moderating through this webinar with us.
Well, thank you, Charina.
Yeah, but thank you.
Thank you.